under half hour. We're only going to be about 15 minutes behind normal for starting church half hour late. So won't be too bad as far as time goes. Okay, so this week, as we're working through Hooker's House for the Word, we're going to be picking up right around page 48. Yes. And we're getting into the meat here of his argument, and he's going to put forward four principles for public worship, four principles for public worship that I think are, when we consider them, are pretty straightforward and reasonable. And that's the point. He's going to try to find common ground and lay out these principles for and then we'll apply them going forward. So I'm very, what do I want to say, zealous that these kinds of principles really take root in our church and in the way we live as a church, the way we operate as a church. These are not something that a lot of churches just assume, but I do believe that they are key, and I think you'll come to agree also that in terms of maintaining harmony as much as possible. We read in Romans 12 for the epistle lesson this morning, as much as it depends on you, live in peace with all men. And keeping the peace of the church body is neither running from every potential conflict, nor is it stirring up every potential conflict, but understanding a hierarchy. What's the order of things? Is this a kind of first tier issue, second tier issue, third tier issue? And depending on what kind of issue it is, what are the principles that come into play for how we resolve this and maintain unity? And so these four principles I think are very important. And here, keep in mind, we're not talking about fundamental doctrines like who is Jesus Christ. We're talking about the proper order of the church. When we get into the proper ordering of things, I've raised this question several weeks in a row now. Is there a place for the church's authority beyond my own private judgment? Okay, so even if it may not be my favorite thing, or if maybe I don't quite get the point of this yet, or the order of why we do this or include that, is there a place for the church's judgment to say, this is the way it's been done, this is the way we're doing it, and say, you know what, my conscience can be at peace with that. This does not have to be treated like a first tier issue. I understand why we do it this way, and I'm going to seek to pursue unity within the body. So, and this is all a matter of public worship. This is not just personal piety issues, but public worship. So on page 49, you get the first principle. The title there is The Dignity in Public Worship, and the first proposition concerning what things are fitting in the outward public ordering of church affairs. Okay. There are two sections in this chapter. I had to grab a book from the stack over there. I had this underlined and notes in it, and I left my book at home. So I'm going to have to, I might stumble a little bit looking for exactly what I wanted to quote. But there's two parts of this chapter, this first principle, and one could be stated this way. We should do and worship in a way that is fitting. That's a word Hooker likes to use a lot, fittingness, okay, which is something that we have lost, okay. I saw a tweet this week. Some of you might know who I'm referring to, but somebody tweeted that if you go outside with spaghetti all over your shirt, and you say, hey, you could probably change your shirt. You're kind of a mess. And the response is, where in the Bible does it say that? Like, that I have to do that? Well, it doesn't say that, obviously, but we have a sense of what is fitting, right? It's not fitting to go out with spaghetti all over your shirt. There's a fittingness to things. And this is true. I used to not understand this in the ignorance of my teenage years, when it came to things like music. So in church, is there a kind of fittingness to music? I took the view that, well, it's only the words that matter, and music is just a neutral medium. And so if you want to have a rap service or a metal service or a contemporary service or a traditional service, the medium is just the medium. It's a matter of preference as long as your words are solid, okay? But there is the music in this case, as an example, is not neutral, right? The medium is a kind of message. Music does things. It evokes certain kinds of emotions and feelings. So there's a fittingness for a funeral. There's a fittingness for a birthday. There is there's a fittingness for the kinds of gifts that you give people on Christmas. It is possible to give very inappropriate gifts, right? Say, well, gift's a gift, right? Because there's certain things that are fitting, and we know what they are, right? If you're looking for a Bible verse, for every fitting thing, you're not going to find it. That doesn't mean it's off the table and everything is fair game, right? There is an appropriateness to whether it's music or how we dress or what we give or how we celebrate. There's a fitting atmosphere appropriate for all of these things. There's a time and place for all things under heaven, if we would go back to Ecclesiastes, right? So right. Well, and so the thing is, back to music in a service, there are, if the goal is to encourage reverence, okay, rock music is, into its very core, and what it's about is irreverence, right? That's the whole point of it, is irreverence. So to have a rock service where the music is communicating irreverence and trying to cultivate a spirit of reverence, it clashes. It does not work, okay? So it doesn't mean there's not a place for rock music, right? What? Hmm. Mm. 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 Yeah, so when we publicly worship together, we should do so in a way that is fitting. Furthermore, he says it should reflect, this is under point 2, this is page 51 where it says 2, that which inwardly each man should be, the church outwardly ought to testify. Okay? Our outward religious practice should reflect the inward piety. Okay? He says, therefore, the religious duties which are seen must correspond to that which our unseen affections ought to be. Signs must resemble the things they signify. If religion bears the greatest sway in our hearts, our outward religious actions as a church must show it as far as we have means and ability. So he's talking about that fitting in terms of beauty. Okay, and I could spend the rest of this class going on a tangent on one of my hobby horses, which is the lack of beauty in many churches, right? Because they say, well, none of this is necessary. God is God. God understands. God looks at the heart. Well, he says God does look at the heart, but what's in the heart should be reflected. If you truly value the worship of God, this is the most important thing to me, then I would say don't have a crappy looking church. Like, now, he says, as far as means allow, right? We're not talking about, you know, poor churches with small budgets just getting started, worshiping, renting the space. That's not the issue. The issue is if your budget allows it and you have the means to do so, why not make a beautiful space? And sometimes there are churches that where people will say, well, God looks at the heart, it's not about the space. But I say, you wouldn't live in a place like that. Your house is much nicer. Your tastes for your own house are much nicer than the church you worship in. So why doesn't your outward worship reflect what you say is most important to you? Okay, so that's a fittingness when it comes to beauty, as far as means allow. Okay, he's not picking on, poor people that don't have a cathedral. Okay, but it should be fitting, it should be appropriate, and the inward piety, what you say you believe, what you say is most valuable, should be reflected in the worship spaces you cultivate, that you build. So, our first principle there is that there's a fittingness to public worship, where beauty is important, and cultivating reverence is important. And if you go to 52, the last paragraph of the section, therefore, let this be our first demand. In the external form of religion, things which clearly appear effectual and fit to teach godliness, either representing the greatness of God, befitting the dignity of religion, or concurring with heavenly thoughts in the minds of men, should be reverently esteemed. A few rare, accidental, tolerable, or at least curable inconveniences notwithstanding. Okay? So we should bring this reverence into our worship. There's a fitting nature. There's things that are fitting. There are things that are not. Okay? That's our first principle. Okay? Second, tradition in public worship, beginning on page 53. The second proposition, if I were to summarize here in my own words, I would say, there should be a bias toward tradition. A bias toward the older, the tried and true, rather than the novel and innovative. We should not, he says, starting that chapter, we should not casually disregard what the judgment of antiquity and the continuous practice of the whole church has considered fitting. So in the question, if the first principle is we should embrace what is fitting, that begs the question, what's fitting? What constitutes fitting? Well, in making these determinations, our bias should be toward antiquity, toward the older rather than the new. Why does he say this? He draws on the Apocrypha book, the Deuterocanonical book, Wisdom, as well as a couple of scripture passages, when he says, older men with maturity and experience have greater judgment than younger people. We all recognize this to be true in a lot of different realms of life. Wisdom and youth, he quotes Job, wisdom and youth rarely travel together. And ordinarily, the world bears out Job's advice to seek wisdom with aged men and with length of days, understanding, Job 12:12. Therefore, if we are trying to decide which of two men should listen to the other, since the aged are generally the most experienced and least subject to rash passions, it has always been considered reasonable to trust and rely on their counsel more than that of other men. Okay, and he expands on why, which is fairly obvious to us. We use this in our everyday life. We tend to trust those who have more experience than others. We lean on them for counsel. We should do the same in our approach to how we worship in the church. What has the church done? What has been tried and true? Rather than what is new and novel. Now, as I was reading this, I was thinking a little bit about our kind of unique cultural moment, because I'm sure you were. Right. So you look and so in what I'm talking about, our unique cultural moment is that what's that? Okay. So we're living in a time when I think it's fair to question, is the older generation a source of wisdom and relevant, necessary experience for the age we're living in? Okay. So I was trying, as I read this and was thinking through this. What's that? Right. Yeah. Right. Right. Yeah. And I don't want to just jump to, well, this is an exception, close the book, I'm done, but try to give, and I'm not saying I'm going to give this now, but try to work on answering, okay, so what is it about our moment that might make what Hooker's general statement, which is generally true, untrue? And yeah. That's where I'm going. Yeah. That's what, yeah. Yeah. Right.
Also, they may still be right on some. Like it's still maybe good to defer to them on certain things.
Mm-hmm.
It still is the wise approach to defer to them on certain things,
Mm-hmm.
but not others.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And that's discernment again. It's like discernment.
Right. And if I could take this in kind of a legal direction, um, the courts, the Supreme Court, likes to try, when they issue their opinions, try to lean on precedent as much as possible. They don't like to come off, even though they often are, as inventing something new. Okay. And so, but that can hurt you in some cases. So, what's that? If the precedent is bad, right? So, after the Dobbs decision in 2022, which overruled Roe versus Wade, um, the accusation against the conservatives on the court who issued that opinion was, you're being activist judges and breaking away from precedent. We've had 50 years of precedent with Roe, and you're breaking away from precedent. Well, was Roe consistent with precedent, or was that a radical decision that departed from constitutional law, traditionally understood? It was, right? So, but that is an effective talking point. It's an effective talking point to say our activist judges undid 50 years of precedent that had been established in Roe. This is horrible, right? And not, I'm sure they do appreciate it, but at least rhetorically not appreciating the radical nature of Roe. And so I think the same can apply here, is that I don't want to be guilty, wittingly or unwittingly, of simply saying, well, my generation's the exception. Okay. And I think there are some in my generation that can be credibly accused of that. People who go in kind of, I don't want to, kind of LARPing in radical trad directions. Let's put it that way. Okay. Where it's not the substance of what they're saying that I'm objecting to. It is their attitude, that they're using trad, but they're in a rebellious way. And it's not actually coming through in their character. Are they being more pious, loving, or anything? Or are they being more, separatist, being more, it's the trad becomes the novel for them, right?
What you find is with a lot of these people, they're like LARPing and strat online, but in real life, they're total degenerates. Like a lot.
Yeah.
That's a big concept.
Mm-hmm.
So they're not practicing what they're preaching. It's kind of just like a lifestyle, like a clothing brand.
Right. Yes. Yeah. So I want to be sensitive to that, but at the same time, I think the basis is of using discernment, as you say, of not necessarily being biased to our most recent older generations, is because when we look at the history, it was that generation that introduced all kinds of radical new ideas departing from their fathers. So, in to the extent we are departing from a recent older generation, it is not to invent something new, but to go back further. Okay? And so the principle, I think, still stands, but to blindly accept the principle without discernment in our time, I think, can lead into some wrong directions. Okay, then we start calling the contemporary evangelical seeker-sensitive church as tradition, right? When it was an innovation, okay? All right, but I think the principle still stands, is we're going to have a bias toward tradition, and I actually try to live that way. And even in my research, even in researching about the Middle Ages and the Reformation, where I focus most of my time, my point is not to undo the Reformation or to be critical for criticism's sake, but I do try to very carefully look at, okay, what is carried over or what is not carried, where may have even the reformers gone a little too far, because you know what? I believe the reformers are also saved by grace, because they're not perfect either. Nobody is. So where was a fence knocked down or a wall removed or something that had a proper place removed for the wrong reason, and a bias was given towards the new over the old? And sometimes that's challenging to my own assumptions. Okay, but I try to be consistent in that, of saying, okay, we've got two options here. I'm going to give my bias toward the tradition until I can find what specifically is wrong with it, right? And so I do want that to be a bias in our church, that we're biased toward the old. That doesn't mean the old's flawless. We're not slaves to it. It's not a magisterium. But we're biased in that direction toward the old until we can find there's something that's really problematic here, right? It is a conservative disposition. Okay, kind of like what G.K. Chesterton said about removing fences unless you know why they're put up, right? And I want that to be a cultural element of this church. That and there is unity to be gained from that, right? So when everybody's coming up with a new idea, no two people are going to come up usually with the same idea, right? But if there is this cultural disposition toward a core, toward the way things have been done, that does provide a basis for greater unity. So the wisdom of what has been tried and true down through church history is what Hooker is really pushing on here. And in summary, on the bottom of page 57, he puts it this way, where it says, number 4, we are therefore bold to propose this as our second petition. With practices that are not obviously beneficial, the judgment of antiquity in favor of what has been handed down should suffice for us not to deem them unfit unless we can point to any significant harms or any clear grounds for taking strong exception to them. Okay? So, even if you can't, this is the opposite, is what the Enlightenment, which has really kind of infused what we even call conservatism, our understanding of conservatism today. Conservative today is just most efficient. So it's like, if you can find it new, it's conservative, it's efficient, if it saves money, if we can get it done faster. The Enlightenment was all about that. Take everything out and inspect it, okay? See if we can make a better mousetrap. See if we can make it more efficiently. See if, because the way we do this thing, it might not be better. I can find a better way to do it. Well, unless it's screwing something up, it's probably there for a reason, right? So unless we can find something actually wrong with it, we're going to keep it.
needlessly and endlessly complicated to the point where it's like any tiny little thing can just break the whole system.
Mm-hmm.
And you go back literally 100 years and you see how simple
Yeah.
something was, and it would
Yeah.
run
Right.
100 years
Right.
like that, and
Right.
it wouldn't break.
Right. No, yeah, I agree.
This quote on 56 is really solid. While the best and the wisest are alive, the world is continually their opponent, a scrupulous observer of their defects and imperfections, but afterwards it admires their virtues just as much as it previously
Yeah,
did.
right. Yeah.
That's a really good quote.
Yep. Yep.
It's like stone the prophets and then you review them later.
Yes. Yep.
That pattern just repeats over and over and over again.
Yep. All right. Principle number 3, third proposition. This is 59, church authority over public worship. Not everything which is, I'm going to begin the chapter here, not everything which is expedient and necessary for ordering spiritual affairs can be ancient in origin. Rather, as an immortal institution, the church always has just as much power to ordain new things never practiced before as it does to confirm those previously established. It is the unique prerogative of wisdom, as queen or sovereign over the other virtues, to prescribe the order of action in all things. In every individual man's actions of common life, this is a matter of moral wisdom. In public and temporal political affairs, of civil wisdom. Similarly, it is the task of ecclesiastical wisdom to devise the particular form for the outward administration of public duties in the service of God or related matters, and determine which things are most suitable for that form. He goes on under this chapter to talk about, it almost seems 180 degrees the opposite of the previous principle, where he's going to say, yes, we're going to be biased toward the old, but another way of saying it is not slaves to the old. So what would that look like? Does that mean, well, we're going to be biased to the old, but whenever we feel like it, we're going to shake it up a little bit and introduce something new? I think it looks like this, because of something I've written recently and on another matter. But let's say you are a country, and England did this, and you're worshiping one way, and then you are living through something like the World Wars. Okay? Do you just come to church and pretend like nothing else is happening in the world? Or do you maybe make some changes to minister to the unique needs of the people at that time, who, in the case of World War, vast amounts of people are dying that to the likes of which the world has never seen. Okay? And I mentioned I wrote about this recently in regard to funerals. Okay, that during the early 1900s, going through the world wars, people started looking back to some of the funeral rites of the late Middle Ages, wanting to recover them, because the funeral rites of the 1800s, the Victorian era, were so simple and pared down. And you have people dying every day. You have the Spanish flu and the World War. It's just like throw it in the ground. Next funeral, throw it in the ground. And people wanted more of the ceremony that had characterized funerals in the early Middle Age, or the late Middle Ages, early modern period. Okay, and so the church started reaching back and incorporating some of those things again. Okay, is that the church just being arbitrary and new for the sake of novelty? No, it's exercising judgment to say these are there's needs we have to respond to. One of those in particular was, if you've heard of reservation of the host in communion, okay? So that is when you don't consume. What we do here, we consume everything, try to consume it discreetly, even though if we don't finish all the bread and the wine. But the practice within the Roman church is to reserve the communion, and it's because it's already been consecrated and set apart. So we try to consume everything from from communion to communion. Reservation was seen as a practice not to be observed by evangelicals, by Protestants. Okay, you didn't reserve communion. Okay, because of what it implied. It implied that you're saying God's over there in that bread. Like, what are we gonna do with that? We can't touch it. Like, if it wasn't consumed, like, what are we gonna do with God? Like, where's God? So, right, so it was not encouraged. It was in the Church of England, it wasn't allowed really at all. But what about soldiers? When you're in war, any day they could be last rites, right? You know, any day could be their last day. And you have soldiers dying all the time. Are you going to reconsecrate every time for every communion for every soldier who's dying? And oh boy, 5 more just died. Oh no, 100 just died over there. Like, or do you reserve, right? They started reserving, okay? Did it mean that they were falling, into some horrible theological misunderstanding of the nature of the elements? No, it was for practical necessity instead of reconsecrating the elements, every 5 minutes, right? So those are things too where the practice of the church is changing a bit because it's being sensitive to what's really going on in the world in that situation. Can the church make a judgment like that? Hooker's saying, yes, the church can make judgments. We don't have to hold to a kind of superstition like we were talking about last week, where when you become such a slave to this is the way we've always done it, it becomes superstitious. Oh, I got to do it this way or I'm going to screw the whole thing up, right? Yeah. Yeah. So this is what he's talking about as our third principle, is that the church has been empowered to make decisions using their discretion to adjust things if need be, right? If circumstances change. And it doesn't have to turn these practices into a kind of rote, idolatrous superstition, saying, unless I say these words in this order, in this way, and I picked up the bread at this time, that it's going to be all wrong, okay? The church has the authority to do this. We're going to have a bias toward the old, but it has the authority to make provision for unique circumstances and changing times. So, if you look over on page 64 to summarize, our third proposition then is this: that at least in cases where neither the evidence of any divine law nor the strength of any indisputable argument discovered by the light of reason, nor any notable public harm can be alleged against that which our own ecclesiastical laws have even recently instituted, the church's authority itself should gain such credit for her laws, at least governing such affairs as those under dispute, that what they declare fitting and appropriate should be deemed weightier than any bare and naked opinion to the contrary. Okay? So Joe Smith thinks this is bad. The church says it's a good idea. We're going to lead toward the church's authority. But notice how he qualifies it there. Unless the church is saying something that is clearly contrary to any evidence in divine law, okay, nor the strength of any indisputable argument discovered by the light of reason. Like, this is just upside down backwards, right? Like Josh's example, planting the tree in the ground upside down, right? Say, well, the church has decided we're going to just do everything upside down and hope it works. Okay, well, that's contrary to just plain reason, common sense, or contrary to divine law. If it's not those things, just because Joe Smith thinks it should be done this way, the church has said this is the way we're going to do it, okay, it's over. That's right. That's right. It didn't hit me. It didn't hit me until you said Joseph instead of Joe. So excellent. Yeah. All right. So fourth principle, and finally, fourth proposition: there can be ancient ordinances, laws allowed by all parties to be just and good. This is somewhat related to the third one. Even divine and apostolic constitutions, which at time nonetheless the church may not keep, but may be set aside without blame. For when we cannot remove an evil without the risk of inviting still worse evils in its place, wisdom necessarily gives way to necessity. All the church can do in such cases is to determine how to mitigate those evils that must be endured and to limit the resulting harms as much as it can, so that when the best things are impossible, we may make the best of those things that are possible. So this is similar but distinct from the third principle. This is about doing the least harm. When you have a bad situation and there are two potential evils, is it appropriate to set aside the norm or the way we're doing it for this special situation so as to not make the problem worse? Okay? An example that comes to my mind is something we talked about last year when I was teaching on marriage. Okay? We hold to the belief in this church that marriage is permanent, right? And that there are no grounds in Scripture for remarriage, right? We talked about that last year. Okay, somebody is in our church, somebody starts coming to church, attending, and we find out they have been divorced and remarried. Is that an ideal? No. But even though we say marriage is one man, one woman, permanent, would it be a possible worse evil if we said, in light of our belief, you need to go separate, break up your household, so your kids are living in a one-parent house, because we believe this principle so strongly, and we're going to be so thoroughly consistent with this, we demand that if you attend here, you need to end your marriage because this is a illegitimate second marriage, right? Now, is it ideal? No. But are we potentially doing a lot more evil by sticking to the rule, right? By forcing a remarried couple to go divorce, dissolve their marriage, and live separately when they have children, okay? That would be an example of that, okay? So I'm sure we could think, if we spend a few moments on this, could think of lots of practical issues of say, hey, this is what's appropriate, not appropriate. This is what's fitting for what we do. But you know what? We could even do this in worship. Like we could say, in regard to that, we've had to make adjustments in times of worship, right, because of snow. Okay, and we could make those adjustments and we still pull it off. We work it out rather than saying, no, it has to start and it has to end this time. You have to be here for this or that. You have to be here for this many Sundays. This is another way of taking what are generally good rules and ways of doing things and not showing mercy, and in doing so, creating worse evils. Okay? So, that's the fourth principle. Taken all together, we should, when it comes to public worship, in terms of our liturgy, in terms of how we worship, in terms of our music, what is fitting and appropriate? When we're deciding what is fitting and appropriate, our bias is toward antiquity, the old over the new. But we recognize the church's authority, just like we practice certain things because decisions were made in the 300s or the 500s or the 700s or the 1000s. Men made decisions then. The church has been given authority to make decisions now, right? Given our times, because this isn't the 1000s anymore. And the church also has the authority to be merciful, to grant exceptions where a worse harm would be done if not otherwise granted. Those are the four principles. So, this is just one. His Laws of Ecclesiastical Polity is 8 books. This is book 5 of Laws of Ecclesiastical Polity. So anyway, and so the whole approach to this is, in his day, trying to find a common ground so the Church of England isn't torn apart, right, in the late 1500s, early 1600s. So, and I think it's useful today. And so let me conclude with this. On He sums all this up. Third, hold on, fourth. He sums all this up where it says 10, this is 75, the danger of private judgment. So this is the whole summary statement. I love this. I shared this yesterday. Now, in matters where the word of God leaves the church to choose her own ordinances, what will happen if the church allowed every man to reprove, to disgrace, and to reject at pleasure things which have been received with great reason? That which the ancient practice of the church has continued from time out of mind. Those ordinances which the power and authority of our present church has devised for the public good. The discretion to use favorable equity at times to soften the rigor of the letter of ecclesiastical laws. In short, to reject at their own liberty everything they see practiced according to the order that has been set down. We know the readiness of men's wits to discover new means to achieve any purpose, and the love that each has of his own discoveries, which make him seem enlightened above the multitudes. If the church allowed each the license to follow his own wits, would it not result in the utter confusion of God's church under the pretense of being taught, led, and guided by his Spirit? The Spirit told me this. I was talking to God the other day, and God gave me this insight that we should do it this way, right? The gifts and graces of the Spirit all tend so naturally to common peace that anyone who finds such a spirit of stubborn individuality in himself should strongly suspect it. For if it came from God, it would persuade others. The same God who revealed it to a few would also give them power to confirm it to the many, either by miracles or a strong and invincible demonstration of sound reason. Thus, it would be clear that God wanted all men's judgments to assent to it. As it is, the error and weakness of their arguments gives us a strong presumption to the contrary, that God has neither moved their hearts to think such things, nor enabled them to prove them. Right. No. Yeah.
No, something that comes to mind also, like outside of our, kind of inside, kind of outside our, like, current modern situation, is when you encounter people who are part of either the Roman Church or the Eastern Church, saying, well, you Protestants, you just, along the way, just decided you could do whatever else you wanted to do. And it seems like they have no problem with all throughout history there being stuff added, 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 added. And then there comes a point where the Reformation in various forms and times starts happening, and certain Christians start to be convinced, like, no, there's so much stuff that's been added that doesn't need to be here. Let's start trimming it back a bit. And that's where they get caught up. That's where the Romanists and that's where the Eastern Orthodox get caught up. They're like, hey, you're taking away from something that is necessarily supposed to be there. When really it's like pouring holy water over the dead foot bones of a saint that we're not even sure it was their foot. It's like, when did that actually become something that was necessary in worship? And now you're making fun of us because we don't do that. Like, I see there being this.
Well, this is where you go to Jewel.
Call it hypocrisy, but it is kind of this weird knot they tie themselves up in.
Well, this is where you go to John Jewel, which we were reading a little bit before the Hooker book came, right? So Jewel, in his apology for the Church of England, is writing, toward that sort of thing. So he's going to go back and show to that point what has been necessary, what is not, and show that there have been these controversies long before the Reformation. And that's what we were reading some of that, right? He's like, so-and-so disagreed with so-and-so, this person, and yet they were all considered within the church. right? Even though they had very different views on certain things, they were considered within the church. So Joel's going to be your resource there, arguing the other way in terms of we are keeping what's essential, and let's debate on what's essential and not, because I can show you, when these certain innovations came in and what their origin was. So he's arguing the other direction, and yes, Hooker's arguing against the fraying, too much fraying. Jules going to argue against too much uniformity that's illegitimate, and Hooker's arguing against too much fraying in multiple directions because everybody wants to exercise their own private judgment on these things. And I think this is really, Andrew gave the example of, the crazy roller coaster stage or whatever, but it really hits me when I look at like the 1800s in America, when you find all of these new cult groups basically because of private judgment on steroids. So all of these different groups, because it's like, well, if I'm an American, nobody can tell me, I pulled myself up. I made something for myself. I've built this homestead. I've built this business. If I can read, if I can be successful, if I can make money, who's to tell me what to believe about, Christianity? I could always move away and start something new. And so I think the end of Hooker's opponents is going to lead to that private judgment kind of thing, where you have everybody's got a word from the Spirit, right? The whole Quaker movement is about getting private words from the Spirit rather than reading the Bible. It's the guided by the inner light. Like, I've got this special insight. God told me this. God told me that, right? And it leads to this radical fracturing in the church. It's not because we want everybody to march like Nazis and look the same. There's a place for our gifts. There's diversity within unity, right? That is good. But this kind of private judgment that Hooker's talking about actually frays churches. It's not that it's like, oh, we're wearing different uniforms. Oh no, the horrors. It actually takes away from the unity that Christ calls us to, right? Because we all think we have this special insight, to apply, and the church has no authority unless they run it by my own private judgment first. And so you get this fraying of churches, the fraying of unity that actually harms the communication of the gospel.